Dalston, and Happy New Year. It's really good to be with you again at the start of 2024. It feels like a while since we gathered like this, just on a regular Sunday. So it's really, really good to be with you and to see you again. And you're with us this morning as we are at the beginning of a new sermon series in the book of Daniel. We're on page 883 of the Bibles on the chairs. Do have that open as we go through, because between now and Easter, we'll be working our way through this well-known Old Testament book with its stories of lions' dens and fiery furnaces. But the question that drives the book is this: how should we live as Christians while we live away from home? How should we live as Christians while we live away from home? The month of January is named after the ancient Roman god Janus. He was famously the god who faced in two directions, looking both forwards and backwards at the same time. And at the start of a new year, I think we often feel a sense of tension or conflict, located in two places, looking both forwards and backwards. But I think that tension points us to a deeper Christian experience. One way of telling the story of the Bible is to tell it as a tale of two cities. There's the city of Jerusalem, the city that is God's holy place, the city that represents the ideal, the place where God is honoured and his will is done. Some people believe that Jerusalem, like that, is actually where we could live now, that we could rebuild or build Jerusalem here on earth. Some people think that we do that by looking backwards, that Jerusalem is kind of behind us, and that if only we could kind of get back to it and get back to the golden days and the golden era, we'd be able to rebuild Jerusalem. Maybe the days when children respected their parents, or when a man's word was his bond, the days before Love Island was even the merest whisper in a TV executive's head. If we could go back to those days, some people think, maybe we'd be able to rebuild Jerusalem. I instinctively believe that Jerusalem is ahead of us. They think that the good old days weren't really that good after all. There were all sorts of problems, even in the greatest times of our country or our nation. And what we need to do is we need to shape the future as we want. We need to put our minds to it. If we kind of all get together, if we all think about what might be able to be and work really hard, we can bring about a new glorious reality. Things can only get better, as that famous mid-90s song famously proclaimed, especially if we kind of embrace the modern and lose the forces that bind us to the past. We might be able to rebuild Jerusalem. But a Christian should be doubtful that Jerusalem either belongs in the past or in the future. And that's because of the other city that the Bible speaks of. If Jerusalem represents the city that's founded and built by God for his honor, for his glory, for his name, Babylon is the city that represents human sinful rebellion against God. The name Babylon comes from the narrative of Genesis chapter 11, where humans gather together and build a great tower. It's an attempt to recreate Eden itself, yet without any reference to God whatsoever. The narrator tells us it's a tower so that humans can make a name for themselves. And the tower is called Babel, which is where the word Babylon comes from. A tale of two cities. And the New Testament tells us that Christians are strangers and exiles. That was the language that the Apostle Peter used in our second reading. We know that we belong in Jerusalem. That's what we have been forgiven for. That's where our new identity is found. But our present reality is Babylon, living in a world that doesn't respect and honor and glorify God as it should. We know the end of the story. We know that the time is coming when God's city, Jerusalem, will be established. The Apostle John sees Jerusalem descending at the end of the Bible story. But until then, we know that Jerusalem won't be found behind us or ahead of us. It won't be found in England or America or Israel or anywhere else. it will be found when the Lord returns. And so the question is, how do we live now? How do we live as Christians when we are living away from home, when we are strangers and aliens and exiles? Or to put it poetically, as one of the Psalms of exile does, how can the Lord's people sing the Lord's song when they are in a strange land? How can the Lord's people sing the Lord's song while they are in a strange land? Daniel's going to wrestle with that question as we go through the next few weeks. But as we begin with Daniel chapter 1, there is one theological truth that we are presented with very clearly, and two implications. One theological truth and two practical implications. So here's the theological truth, and it's this: the Lord rules even in a strange land. The Lord rules even in a strange land. Daniel chapter 1 is unambiguous that even though God's people find themselves in exile and away from home, they aren't beyond his sovereign care. This chapter presents us with a God who rules both over the geopolitical events of the world and also the intimate details of our lives. So have a look at verses 1 and 2, which gives us a location, the whole narrative. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it, and the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Those two verses are the record of a national disaster. Babylon was the global superpower of its day. We're thinking 600-700 BC, so nearly just over 2.5 millennia ago. And Judah is a tiny nation state, following the division of Israel into two countries, Israel in the north and Judah with its capital in the south. And here is at the end of the nation of Judah as it was known, and seemingly the end of God's purposes with his people Israel. So Daniel is an Israelite, and he, along with the glories, the riches of the temple of God in Jerusalem, are carried off into exile in Babylon. And a historian might be content with the simple narrative, just giving us the facts, the times, the dates, the places, the people, and the names. But the narrator of Daniel gives us a theological perspective. This is the Lord's doing. Have a look at verse 2 again. The Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. The Lord delivered, or the Lord gave, the king of Judah into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. This isn't a random act of a vindictive God. God's own standards apply to his own people, and God is faithful to his word, even his words of warning against his people when they abandon his ways. This exile, the narrator wants us to know, is God's doing. He is in charge even over the great geopolitical acts and events of the time. 2024 is being called democracy's biggest ever year. Jody referred to it earlier, but it's thought that this year, in the next 12 months, elections of various kinds are taking place in over 65 countries around the world, including the UK, the US, the EU, India, Pakistan, Russia, and Ukraine. It's estimated that around 1.5 billion people will go to the polls in the next 12 months around the world, which would set a new record. We'll get lots of coverage of those elections in our news feeds and news cycles over the next and riders, who's up and who's down. For political nerds, it's something of a dream, I think, the next 12 months ahead. But here's the thing that we ought to tell ourselves each time we see a headline on our website of choice. For each one of those votes cast, The Lord rules. The Lord rules. It's not beyond his sovereign care and control who is up and who is down. The Lord rules. And God is also ruling over the minor details of the narrative, as well as those really big kind of macro events. He's in charge of the minor details of the narrative. Look down at verse 9. We're told, after Daniel and his friends resolved not to defile themselves with the royal food and wine, we're told in verse 9, God had caused the official to show favour and sympathy to Daniel. It's actually, where we read had caused, it's the same word as used in verse 2. The Lord gave favour to Daniel and to his friends. Look on to verse 17. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. It's the same word. The Lord gave. You see, God is not just the God of the big picture of the supranational events taking place around the world. He is the Lord of the minor details of our lives. He is the one who knows what's going on in our lives. He's not distant. He's not absent. He's not just on a big throne ruling over the big things of a big world. He is the Lord who's in charge of the minor details of our lives, who knows what is going on. He is the Lord who rules even in a strange land. Even when we're not sure why 2024 is working out for us as it is, should that be the case, we can be confident of this: the Lord rules. It's not beyond his sovereign care, sovereign love, and sovereign rule. That's the theological truth that underpins Daniel chapter 1. Even in a strange land, the Lord rules. So let me spell out 2 implications for how we are to live away from home. Here's the first one. The Lord rules, so don't withdraw from his world. The Lord rules, so don't withdraw from his world. Now, it's not uncommon to find communities of Christians withdrawing from the world in various ways. There are any number of documentaries you can watch on Netflix about various Christian cults down the years. Some years ago, a friend of mine was involved in planting a church in Oxford. The church had managed to buy a building that they were going to meet in that had been built as a meeting house for a strict Brethren congregation. Apparently, Brethren meeting houses only have windows very high up in the walls or the ceiling. They don't have windows at eye level around them because, my friend told me, Brethren churches only want to look out at the Jerusalem that's coming. They don't want to look out at the Babylon that surrounds them or be seen by the Babylon that's all around them. But notice in this chapter how much Daniel engages in the world that he finds himself in. Now, he does draw a line, and we'll think about that in just a second, but notice how much he engages in that he doesn't withdraw from. He's probably a teenager at this point in the narrative. He's maybe 13 or 14 years old when he finds himself in Babylon, and he's sent, we're told, to the finest Babylonian school. Have a look at verses 3 and 4 and 5. There are no Old Testament classes in his Babylonian school. He's not being taught the Torah or the Ten Commandments. Instead, he learns the language and literature of the Babylonians. In other words, he's being taught to engage in and read and understand and learn the culture in which he finds himself in. And he doesn't try to disengage from it. He doesn't try to kind of only read kind of Old Testament texts instead. Instead, he learns the language and literature of the Babylonians. He learns the stories that the Babylonians tell about themselves. It's how the Babylonians see the world and why they see the world as they do. He doesn't disengage from it. Now, it might not be Buddhism. It might not be the postmodernism of our world or any other isms that you might want to choose, but Daniel is engaged with the world that he finds himself in. Maybe you're at school at the moment. Maybe you have children who are at school at the moment. Maybe you're at university or about to go to university. It's hugely easy to lament the decline in biblical literacy and understanding in our education system. But the question I think Daniel 1 would want to ask us is this: how can we help our children, or if you are at school or university, how can you learn to understand the world that you are in? How is it possible for you to talk through, as much as it is possible with your children, the values and ideals and hopes and concerns and anxieties of the world that they find themselves in? What are the kinds of stories that our kids are learning and being taught about and engaging in? And how can we help them to work those things through? Not kind of uncritically, not just accepting whatever they hear and read and are told, but how can we help them to read those things in the light of the gospel? To understand those texts of this is a world that God has made. How do we begin to engage critically and helpfully with the world that our kids are in, or the world that you are in at the moment? Daniel doesn't disengage or withdraw from his education, and more than that, he actually engages in a political career. So we're told that Daniel and the young men that he is with are being trained so that they might serve in the Babylonian court, so that they might serve King Nebuchadnezzar himself. Don't miss the shock of what that might feel like to Daniel and his friends. They are being trained to serve the king of the enemies of God's people. Think about what that must have felt like for Daniel and his friends. Not only has their home, as far as they know, been completely destroyed, not only do they find themselves in this strange land, but they are being trained to serve directly the person who's done all of that to them, the king of Babylon himself. I don't know how emotionally difficult that must have been for them. It would have been quite understandable, I think, if they'd tried to withdraw, disengage from all of that in all sorts of ways, but they don't. Instead, he engages in a political career, and we'll see where that career takes him over the coming chapters. His career is in service of a pagan king, serving the enemies of God's people. Today, you've probably picked it up from our service so far this morning, but the church is celebrating the Feast of Epiphany today. It's particularly associated with the stories of the Magi visiting the baby Jesus, but it celebrates, it's a feast that celebrates that the Messiah of Israel isn't just for Israel, but he is the light to all the nations. And it's fitting, I think, this morning that we're reading a narrative that's about the people of God in and amongst the nations, involved in places that are a long way away from Jerusalem, involved in places that are not at all comfortable for God's people to be in. And here we see how God's light works. It works as his people engage in the life of the world that they find themselves, for God's glory, for God's name, in God's service, but not withdrawing to their own little huddle, but engaging in the life of the world that they find themselves in. Now that's hard, I know. Some years ago, I was chatting to a Christian. It was just we were chatting at a party, but I was chatting to a who works in advertising. Or he did at the time. And he said that he was deeply conflicted. He was thinking about giving his job up. He said he was deeply conflicted about working in that industry, that much of what was expected of kind of his output and his work was basically dishonest, was his view on it. And he didn't quite know what to do with that as a Christian believer. He just found it very, very hard to feel like he was basically lying to people a lot of the time. But those are precisely the places where the light of the gospel, where the light of lives that are lived faithfully to Jesus are most needed. So what if people were to use their gifts and skills in precisely those places where God seems absent for his glory, to glorify and serve him? There is, of course, no way that the king of Babylon is going to come to Jerusalem to worship God, but what if the worshippers of God from Jerusalem find their way to the king of Babylon? That's how the light of Jesus Christ is made known in the nations, as his people don't withdraw. Secondly, God's people don't withdraw, but also that they don't compromise. God's people don't compromise. Now, involvement in the world clearly can mean assimilation. That's clearly the goal of the Babylonian system and what the king of Babylon wants to do here. Life is obviously much simpler if you don't give your enemies a reason to hate you, but instead you give them all that they might think they need or want. But here's the second implication of living under God's rule in a strange land. Don't compromise. So verse 8, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. We don't actually know why Daniel draws this line. There's lots of speculation. Is it because he's trying to observe the various food laws of the Old Testament? But there's nothing offered that would seem to contravene those laws as far as we can tell from the text itself. It could be about idolatry. It could be that he's concerned about food that's been sacrificed to idols, but again, there isn't any evidence as far as we know that that's what Daniel is concerned about. Presumably that would relate to all foods, not just the food that he is abstaining from. The important point in the narrative is simply that Daniel is drawing a line somewhere. He doesn't do it to pick a fight. He's not trying to be difficult. Notice that as he draws his line, he negotiates and navigates his way skillfully around people. So he goes to the official who's in charge and says, please, can we do this? He hears no, so he goes one rung down the ladder and has a conversation with the official who's in charge of him. Can we try this for 10 days? It doesn't have to be a permanent thing, but let's try this for 10 days and see how it goes. But the point is that there is, however small it may seem, however careful Daniel is with it, that there is a small act of resistance. Daniel is saying no and drawing a line that he will not cross. And a small act of resistance here is going to stand him in good stead for the trials that are going to come later on, when there will be much more that's on the line, both for himself and for his friends. How do we know day to day where we need to draw a line? I think much of that question is actually about temperament and personality. And it seems to me that there are two possible dangers. For some Christians, every decision, every possible line that we might draw is a matter of principle. The world is entirely black and white, and life is lived in a kind of constant sense of conflict with the world around, that absolutely everything has to be interrogated and worked out as a matter of principle. And lines are drawn, as a result, all over the place. For others, I think the opposite danger is that lines are simply never drawn. The world is entirely grey. There's no black and white at all, apart from where it's mixed together. Every issue is complex and requires another perspective. Matters of principle are clear, but they just never actually seem to arrive. Now, that's obviously an exaggerated picture, but most of us would be drawn to one of those ends of the spectrum. And so there's a question for us. How do we know where to draw a line? Some of it simply comes down to how we're wired and what our context is, and whether we are more likely to try to keep matters that might require line drawing at arm's length. Clearly, where the Bible draws a line, we mustn't cross it. That's simply the case for us as Christians. But often there is some space where Christians will differ before we get to the line. So maybe, think of any, pretty much any ethical issue that the New Testament talks about. Think about giving to your local congregation. The New Testament is clear that Christians are to give to their local congregation. But circumstances differ. Circumstances are different for people who have a regular income and people who have more of a kind of irregular income, a more hand-to-mouth type situation. It's clear that we must give, that we ought to give, but what that looks like might not necessarily be the same for all of us. So here are two questions to ponder as we head into the new year. I don't know if you're a New Year's resolution kind of person. I'm not massively, but here are two questions to ponder as we head into the new year. Are there places, are there strange lands in your life where you have become too withdrawn? Are there places where you are opting out of too much simply because it's difficult, and as a Christian you're not quite sure where or how to make sense of things? Are there places where you have become too withdrawn? Or are there places that you need to draw a line? Are there places where you find yourself thinking that for the sake of my conscience, for the sake of my witness to the gospel and the light of the Lord Jesus, I need to draw a line here. I need to say no. Maybe it's something personally, maybe it's something at work or at school. But are there places where, for the sake of your own conscience and for the sake of your witness, you need to draw a line? Make some time just to reflect on that over the next days or this week. Are there places where you've become too withdrawn, or places that you need to draw a line? Because the Lord rules, even in a strange land, even when 2024 might feel like it's unknown and uncertain, the Lord rules. It's not out of his control, it's not out of his hand. So for the sake of shining his light into the world, how do we engage with the places that the Lord has called us, both for our good, for the good of the world, and for his glory?